Imagine a war not against a country, but against a criminal empire so powerful it's been labeled a terrorist organization. The Sinaloa cartel is flooding the US with deadly drugs, and now, the US is fighting back, not just with police, but with warships, drones, and soldiers. But at what cost? This is the story of a battle that could change the Americas forever. In 2025, the fight against the Sinaloa cartel, one of the world's most dangerous drug trafficking organizations, reached a turning point. For the first time, the US charged cartel leaders with narco-terrorism, calling them a threat to national security. But it didn't stop there. American warships sailed toward Latin America, drones flew over Mexico, and the threat of military strikes loomed large. From massive drug seizures to a tense standoff with Mexico, this is the story of how the US declared war on the cartels, and what it means for millions of lives on both sides of the border. In May 2025, a courtroom in San Diego, California, became the center of a historic moment in the fight against drug cartels. On May 13, the US government unsealed a groundbreaking indictment that charged leaders of the Sinaloa cartel, one of the world's most dangerous criminal organizations, with crimes that went far beyond drug trafficking. For the first time, the US labeled these leaders as terrorists, accusing them of narco-terrorism and providing material support to terrorism. At the heart of this legal battle were Pedro Inzunza Noriega, a 62-year-old cartel boss known as Sagittario, and his 33-year-old son, Pedro Inzunza Coronel, nicknamed Pican. This indictment marked a bold new chapter in America's war on drugs, driven by a powerful executive order and a special unit in California with a long history of taking down cartels. Here's the story of how this moment unfolded and why it matters. The indictment, filed in the Southern District of California, was unlike any before it. Pedro Inzunza Noriega and his son were charged with narco-terrorism under Title 21 of the U.S. Code, a crime that carries a mandatory minimum of 20 years in prison and a maximum of life, along with fines up to $20 million. This charge wasn't just about selling drugs. It accused the Inzunzas of using the drug empire to spread fear and violence, much like a terrorist organization. They were also charged with providing material support to terrorism, a crime under Title 18 that could add another 20 years in prison. These charges signaled a major shift. The U.S. was no longer treating the Sinaloa cartel as just a criminal group but as a threat to national security. Alongside the Inzunzas, 5 other leaders of the Beltran Leyva organization, BLO, a violent faction of the Sinaloa cartel, were charged with drug trafficking and money laundering. These included David Alejandro Heredia Velázquez, Oscar René González Menéndez, Elias Alberto Quiroz Benavides, Daniel Eduardo Bojorquez, and Javier Alonso Vázquez Sanchez. The charges painted a picture of a sophisticated network that moved massive amounts of fentanyl, cocaine, methamphetamine, and heroin into the U.S., while laundering millions of dollars to keep their operations running. The indictment described the blow as the world's largest known fentanyl production network, responsible for flooding American communities with a drug that kills tens of thousands every year. The Beltran Leyva organization, led by Pedro Inzunza Noriega, has a fearsome reputation in Mexico. Once a key part of the Sinaloa cartel, the blow broke away years ago but remained one of its most powerful and brutal factions. Court documents revealed that the blow controls drug trafficking routes, or plazas, across Mexico, including the border city of Tijuana. The group is known for its extreme violence, engaging in shootouts, murders, kidnappings, torture, and debt collection to maintain its grip on power. They target anyone who stands in their way, from rival cartel members to government officials, all while making millions from their illegal trade. Pedro Inzunza Noriega, the patriarch, works closely with his son to oversee one of the most advanced fentanyl production networks in the world. Over several years, they allegedly trafficked tens of thousands of kilograms of fentanyl into the U.S., a drug so potent that even small amounts can be deadly. On December 3, 2024, Mexican authorities struck a major blow against the insurgentes, seizing 1,500 kilograms of fentanyl, more than 1.65 tons, in Sinaloa, the largest fentanyl seizure ever recorded. This raid targeted sites controlled by the father and son, proving just how massive their operation was. The indictment made it clear, the U.S. was determined to stop the BLO's deadly influence. The indictment was made possible by a bold move from the White House. On February 20, 2025, President Donald Trump signed Executive Order 14157, officially designating the Sinaloa Cartel as a foreign terrorist organization, FTO. This was a dramatic escalation in the fight against cartels. By labeling the Sinaloa Cartel as a terrorist group, the U.S. gained new tools to combat it, including the ability to freeze assets, ban travel, and even use military force. The order didn't just target the Sinaloa Cartel, it also named 5 other Mexican cartels, like the Jalisco New Generation Cartel and the Gulf Cartel, as FTOs, signaling a broader war on drug trafficking. Attorney General Pamela Bondi called the Sinaloa Cartel a complex, dangerous terrorist organization, and vowed to seek life sentences for its leaders. U.S. Attorney Adam Gordon, leading the Southern District of California, described the cartels as a cancer that spreads violence, corruption, and fear. The FTO designation gave the government the legal muscle to treat cartel leaders like enemy combatants, not just criminals. This shift set the stage for the historic charges against the insurgentes and their associates, making it clear that the U.S. was ready to use every tool at its disposal to dismantle the cartel. The Southern District of California, where the indictment was filed, has a long history of battling Mexico's most powerful cartels. Based in San Diego, just miles from the U.S.-Mexico border, this district has been a frontline in the war on drugs for decades. In the past, it led major efforts to dismantle the Arellano Felix cartel, a notorious group that once controlled Tijuana's drug trade. More recently, it has targeted leaders of the Sinaloa cartel and the Jalisco New Generation cartel, earning a reputation as a hub for aggressive anti-cartel prosecutions. The May 2025 indictment was the first major case brought by the district's newly formed narco-terrorism unit, established in April 2025 under U.S. Attorney Adam Gordon. This specialized unit was created to focus on the growing threat of cartels, combining the expertise of federal agencies like Homeland Security Investigations, HSI, and the FBI with the Department of Justice's resources. The unit's mission is to identify, disrupt, and prosecute high-level cartel members, and its debut with the Insunza indictment showed its determination to take on the most dangerous players. Sean Gibson, HSI San Diego's special agent in charge, said the unit's work reflects a unified effort to protect American communities from cartel-driven drug trafficking. The indictment of Pedro Insunza Noriega and his son is more than a legal document. It's a signal that the U.S. is redefining how it fights cartels. By charging them with narco-terrorism, the government is treating their actions as a direct attack on the nation's safety, not just a crime. The Beltran-Leyva organization's role in producing and trafficking fentanyl, a drug linked to over 80,000 overdose deaths in the U.S. each year, underscores the urgency of this fight. Executive Order 14157 has given law enforcement and prosecutors new powers, but it has also raised tensions with Mexico, which sees the terrorist label as a threat to its sovereignty. The Southern District of California's narco-terrorism unit is leading the charge, building on decades of experience to target cartel leaders like never before. As the U.S. ramps up its efforts, the world is watching to see what comes next. Will these charges dismantle the Sinaloa cartel, or will they spark a larger conflict? One thing is clear, the battle against the cartels has entered a new, more intense phase, and the stakes have never been higher. The Sinaloa cartel, one of the world's most powerful criminal organizations, has built a vast empire by flooding the United States with deadly drugs like fentanyl and cocaine. In 2024 and 2025, Law enforcement on both sides of the US-Mexico border struck major blows against this cartel, seizing record-breaking amounts of drugs and exposing the scale of their operations. From a historic 1,500 kilogram fentanyl seizure in Sinaloa to a $4.4 million cocaine bust in Laredo, Texas, these operations revealed the cartel's sophisticated production and trafficking networks. Behind these seizures lies a darker story of how the cartel produces and moves drugs, using brutal violence to maintain control over Mexican territories. This is the story of the Sinaloa cartel's drug trade and the efforts to stop it. On December 3, 2024, Mexican authorities carried out a massive raid in Sinaloa, the heart of the cartel's operations. They targeted multiple locations controlled by Pedro Inzunza Noriega and his son, Pedro Inzunza Coronel, leaders of the Beltran Leyva organization, BLO, a key faction of the Sinaloa cartel. The result was staggering: 1,500 kilograms, over 1.65 tons, of fentanyl, the largest fentanyl seizure in history. This synthetic opioid, 50 times stronger than heroin, is so potent that even a tiny dose can kill. The seizure disrupted a major supply line to the US, where fentanyl is linked to over 80,000 overdose deaths each year. The drugs were found in hidden labs and storage sites, showing the cartel's ability to produce and stockpile fentanyl on an industrial scale. Less than a year later, on October 1, 2025, U.S. Customs and Border Protection, CBP, officers at the World Trade Bridge in Laredo, Texas, made another significant discovery. During a routine inspection, a CBP officer flagged a 2022 Pinnacle tractor-trailer carrying trailer parts for a secondary check. Using a canine unit and advanced scanning technology, officers uncovered 144 packages hidden inside, containing 335.10 pounds of cocaine with a street value of $4,474,272. This seizure was a snapshot of the cartel's relentless efforts to smuggle drugs across the border, often hiding them in legitimate shipments to avoid detection. Homeland Security Investigations, HSI, took over the case, signaling a deeper probe into the cartel's cross-border networks. These seizures were not isolated events. Court documents revealed that the Sinaloa cartel, particularly the BLO, has trafficked tens of thousands of kilograms of fentanyl, cocaine, methamphetamine, and heroin into the U.S. over recent years. Another major bust in Mexico City uncovered 1,680 kilograms of cocaine, some branded with logos like Incredibles and R, showing the cartel's bold marketing tactics. Authorities also found rainbow-colored fentanyl pills and bricks stamped with luxury brand names like Louis Vuitton and Rolls-Royce, designed to appeal to users and disguise the drug's deadly nature. These discoveries painted a clear picture. The Sinaloa cartel operates like a global corporation, with sophisticated production and distribution systems. The Sinaloa cartel's drug trade begins in clandestine labs hidden across Mexico, particularly in Sinaloa, where the blow has perfected fentanyl production. Fentanyl is made from precursor chemicals, often sourced from China, which are smuggled into Mexico through ports or overland routes. In secret labs, often located in rural areas or hidden in urban warehouses, chemists mix these chemicals to create fentanyl powder or press it into pills. The process is cheap and efficient, allowing the cartel to produce massive quantities. A single kilogram of fentanyl can yield millions of doses, making it highly profitable. The Inzunza's network, described as one of the largest fentanyl operations in the world, runs these labs with military-like precision, guarded by armed enforcers. Cocaine production, meanwhile, often starts in South America, where coca leaves are grown and processed into powder. The Sinaloa cartel partners with suppliers in countries like Colombia, using its vast network to move cocaine north through Central America and Mexico. Once in Mexico, the drugs are stored in safe houses or hidden in vehicles, like the tractor-trailer seized in Laredo. To cross the U.S. border, the cartel uses creative methods, hiding drugs in shipments of goods, using tunnels under the border, or employing mules, who carry small amounts on foot. The BLO's control of key border plazas, like Tijuana, gives them access to smuggling routes that are heavily guarded and fiercely contested. Trafficking is a high-stakes operation. Cartel operatives bribe officials, use encrypted communications, and rely on spotters to track law enforcement movements. The drugs are often disguised to blend in, as seen in the Laredo seizure, where cocaine was hidden among trailer parts. Once in the U.S., the drugs are distributed through networks of gangs, like MS-13, to cities across the country. The cartel's ability to move drugs quickly and evade detection shows their logistical expertise, rivaling that of legitimate businesses. The Sinaloa cartel's power comes not just from drugs but from its iron grip on Mexican territories. The BLO, under leaders like Pedro Inzunza Noriega, controls key plazas across Mexico, including Tijuana, a major gateway for drugs entering the U.S. These plazas are like territories in a war, where the cartel fights rivals, police, and even the military to maintain dominance. Court documents describe the blow as one of Mexico's most violent groups, using shootouts, murders, kidnappings, torture, and debt collection to enforce their rule. They target anyone who threatens their operations, from rival cartel members to local officials. In Sinaloa, the cartel's stronghold, violence is a daily reality. The internal war between Sinaloa cartel factions has led to over 1,300 deaths and 1,500 missing persons in the state alone. Civilians, like Vivian Espiro, whose body was found after she went missing, are often caught in the crossfire. The cartel uses fear to control communities, kidnapping or killing those who refuse to pay extortion fees or cooperate. They also attack government forces, targeting police and officials to weaken resistance. This violence creates a climate of terror, allowing the cartel to operate with impunity while making millions from the drug trade. The BLO's control extends beyond Sinaloa to cities like Guadalajara, Nogales, and even international hubs like Guatemala City and San Jose, Costa Rica, where indicted leaders like Oscar René González Menendez and Elias Alberto Quiroz Benavides operate. Armed enforces patrol their territories, and the cartel invests in advanced weapons and technology, including drone detection systems, to protect their operations. This level of control shows why the U.S. now views the cartel as a terrorist organization, not just a criminal group. The massive drug seizures in 2024 and 2025 were victories for law enforcement, but they also showed the scale of the challenge. The 1,500 kilogram fentanyl seizure disrupted the Inzunza's network, but the cartel's ability to produce and move drugs remains strong. The Laredo cocaine bust highlighted the cartel's creative smuggling tactics, which continue to evolve. Sean Gibson, HSI San Diego's special agent in charge, said these efforts reflect a unified effort to dismantle the cartel and protect American communities. The FBI's Houghton Moshrafai added that the BLO's drugs destroy lives and communities and threaten national security. The seizures are part of a broader U.S. strategy, backed by President Trump's Executive Order 14,157, which labeled the Sinaloa cartel a foreign terrorist organization. This has led to increased cooperation with Mexican authorities, who carried out the historic fentanyl raid. But the cartel's violent control over Mexican territories and the vast drug networks mean the fight is far from over. As the U.S. escalates its efforts, the Sinaloa cartel is adapting, moving operations to new areas and forming alliances with other groups. The battle against the drug empire is a high-stakes struggle, with lives and communities hanging in the balance. In 2025, the United States took its fight against the Sinaloa cartel to a new level, moving far beyond police raids and courtroom battles. The Trump administration, determined to crush the cartel's deadly drug trade, turned to the military, treating the cartel not as a criminal group but as an enemy in a war. A secret Pentagon directive authorized drone strikes and special forces operations, while over 330 surveillance flights scoured Mexico for cartel targets. American warships sailed toward Venezuela, signaling a broader campaign against drug networks. This dramatic shift from law enforcement to warfare marked a turning point in the battle against the Sinaloa cartel, but it came with serious risks that could reshape the Americas. Here's the story of how the U.S. military entered the fight and what it means for the future. In August 2025, President Donald Trump quietly signed a directive that changed the rules of the game. This secret order gave the Pentagon permission to use military force against the Sinaloa cartel and other drug organizations labeled as foreign terrorist organizations, FTOs, under Executive Order 14157. For the first time, the U.S. was preparing to treat cartel leaders like enemy combatants, not just criminals. The directive allowed for drone strikes, special forces raids, and naval operations to target cartel labs, weapons depots, and leaders like Pedro Inzanza Noriega of the Beltran Leyva organization, BLO. The plan drew inspiration from U.S. military campaigns against terrorist groups like ISIS. It called for shock and awe tactics, fast, powerful strikes to destroy cartel operations before they could respond. Special forces, including elite units like the Navy SEALs, were tasked with planning raids to capture or eliminate high-value targets, such as the Inzanzas or other BLO leaders like Fausto Isidro Meza Flores, known as Chapo Isidro. Drone strikes were authorized to hit drug labs and storage sites, aiming to disrupt the cartel's fentanyl and cocaine production. The directive signaled a clear message. The U.S. was no longer relying on arrests and trials but was ready to use lethal force to dismantle the cartel. To prepare for these operations, the U.S. military launched an unprecedented intelligence-gathering effort. U.S. Northern Command, responsible for North American security, conducted over 330 surveillance flights over Mexico in 2025. These missions used advanced aircraft like U-2 spy planes, RC-135 rivet joints, P-8 Poseidon patrol planes, and various drones to map cartel activities. The flights focused on Sinaloa, Tijuana, and other cartel strongholds, tracking drug labs, smuggling routes, and key figures. This wasn't casual spying. These were systematic operations to build detailed target lists for potential military strikes. The surveillance revealed the Sinaloa cartel's vast reach. Images showed hidden fentanyl labs in rural Sinaloa, heavily guarded by armed enforcers. Smuggling routes through Tijuana's border plazas were monitored, showing how drugs like the 1,500 kilograms of fentanyl seized in December 2024 moved north. The data also exposed the cartel's growing sophistication, including their use of encrypted communications and drone detection technology to evade authorities. These flights gave the U.S. a clearer picture of the cartel's operations but also raised tensions with Mexico, which saw the overflights as a violation of its sovereignty. The most dramatic sign of the U.S. military's escalation came in the Caribbean, far from Mexico's border. In late 2025, the U.S. deployed 3 Aegis-guided missile destroyers, USS Gravely, USS Jason Dunham, and USS Samson, to waters off Venezuela. These warships, accompanied by 4,000 personnel, including 2,200 Marines, a nuclear-powered attack submarine, and P-8 Poseidon aircraft, were sent to disrupt cartel drug routes linked to Venezuela. The Sinaloa cartel and other groups use Caribbean waters to move cocaine from South America to Mexico and beyond, often with the help of corrupt officials in Venezuela. This naval deployment was not just a show of force, it was preparation for serious combat operations. The destroyers, equipped with advanced missiles, could target cartel boats or coastal hideouts. Marines were ready for amphibious raids, while the submarine and aircraft patrolled for drug shipments. The move stunned the region, with Venezuela's President Nicolás Maduro mobilizing 4.5 million militia members and banning drones in response. The U.S. claimed the operation targeted cartels, but it raised fears of a broader conflict, with some seeing it as a step toward regime change in Venezuela. The shift from law enforcement to military action marked a seismic change in how the U.S. fights the Sinaloa cartel. For decades, agencies like the DEA, FBI, and Homeland Security Investigations, HSI, led the charge, using arrests, indictments, and seizures like the $4.4 million cocaine bust in Laredo in October 2025. But the Trump administration argued that these methods weren't enough. With 98% of U.S. fentanyl coming from Mexico and over 80,000 overdose deaths annually, the cartel was seen as a national security threat. Labeling them a terrorist organization under Executive Order 14157 allowed the U.S. to use military tools, treating cartel leaders like terrorists rather than drug lords. Secretary of State Marco Rubio explained the reasoning. Cartels aren't just selling drugs. They're involved in human trafficking, arms smuggling, and even connections with international terrorist groups. This justified a military response, but it also blurred the line between crime fighting and warfare. FBI Acting Special Agent Houghton Moshrafai said the BLO's drugs threaten our national security, while Attorney General Pamela Bondi vowed to seek life sentences for these terrorists. The shift gave the U.S. new power but also raised questions about how far this war would go. This military escalation carries serious risks. First, it strains U.S.-Mexico relations. Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum rejected U.S. military intervention, calling it an invasion, and emphasizing Mexico's sovereignty. The surveillance flights and talk of drone strikes have fueled anger in Mexico, where memories of past U.S. interventions run deep. If the U.S. launches strikes on Mexican soil without approval, it could spark a diplomatic crisis or even armed resistance. Second, the cartels are not standing still. Intelligence reports show the Sinaloa cartel is adapting, scaling back fentanyl production in Sinaloa and moving operations to other states. They're acquiring drone detection technology and weapons, possibly preparing for a military confrontation. Alliances with groups like the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, CJNG, and MS-13 could make them even more dangerous, with the potential for retaliatory attacks on U.S. soil. Third, the human cost is already high. In Sinaloa, cartel violence has killed over 1,300 people and left 1,500 missing, with civilians like Vivian Espero caught in the crossfire. Military action could escalate this violence, turning cartel territories into war zones. Human rights groups warn of civilian casualties and regional instability, comparing it to conflicts like Syria. The naval deployment off Venezuela has also raised fears of a broader regional conflict, with countries like Colombia warning of chaos if U.S. military action spread. The U.S. military's escalation against the Sinaloa cartel in 2025 marks a bold and risky new phase in the war on drugs. The secret Pentagon directive, surveillance flights, and naval deployment show a commitment to destroying the cartel's drug empire, but they also push the conflict into uncharted territory. By treating the cartel as a terrorist enemy, the U.S. has raised the stakes, risking diplomatic fallout, cartel retaliation, and civilian suffering. As warships patrol Caribbean waters and drones fly over Mexico, the world watches to see if this war will dismantle the Sinaloa cartel or ignite a larger, more dangerous conflict. In 2025, the escalating war between the United States and the Sinaloa cartel has turned parts of Mexico, especially Sinaloa, into a battleground. While the U.S. pushes forward with military plans, historic drug seizures, and terrorism charges against cartel leaders like Pedro Inzunza Noriega, the real cost is being paid by ordinary people. In Sinaloa alone, over 1,300 people have been killed, and 1,500 others have gone missing due to cartel violence. Civilians like Vivian Espero, whose tragic story gripped communities, have become symbols of the suffering. Caught between the cartel's brutal control and the aggressive response from government forces, entire towns are living in fear. This is the story of the human cost of the U.S. cartel conflict and the communities trapped in its crossfire. Sinaloa, the birthplace of the Sinaloa cartel, has long been a hub for drug trafficking, but 2025 brought a new level of violence. The internal war between cartel factions, worsened by U.S. pressure through indictments and military threats, has turned streets into war zones. Court documents describe the Beltran Leyva organization, BLO, a powerful faction led by Pedro Inzunza Noriega, as one of Mexico's most violent groups. They use murders, kidnappings, and torture to control drug routes and silence rivals. But it's not just cartel members dying, ordinary people are paying the price. Since September 2024, when fighting between Sinaloa cartel factions exploded, over 1,300 people have been killed in Sinaloa state. These include cartel members, police, and soldiers, but many are civilians caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. Shootouts in cities like Culiacán and Los Mochis have left bullet-riddled buildings and blood-stained streets. The violence is relentless, with bodies found almost daily, some in mass graves, others abandoned on roadsides. Families live in constant fear, knowing that a trip to the market or a walk home could end in tragedy. The 1,500 missing persons in Sinaloa tell an even darker story. Many are victims of disappearances, a tactic used by cartels to spread fear. People vanish without a trace, taken from their homes, cars, or workplaces. Missing persons posters line the streets, each one a desperate plea from a family searching for answers. The numbers are staggering, but behind each statistic is a human story of loss and heartbreak. One name stands out among the missing: Vivian Espuro. In 2025, her face appeared on posters across Sinaloa, a haunting reminder of the violence engulfing the region. Vivian, a young woman from a small town, was reported missing after a wave of cartel clashes swept through her community. Her family held vigils, hoping for her safe return, but their worst fears were confirmed when her body was found weeks later. Authorities believe she was caught in the crossfire of a cartel dispute, an innocent victim of the escalating conflict. Vivian's story is not unique. Families across Sinaloa share similar grief, with loved ones killed or abducted by cartels seeking to maintain power. A 23-year-old student disappeared last week, his poster joining others on lampposts and walls. A mother was taken from her home after refusing to pay extortion fees to the blow. These tragedies show how civilians, with no connection to the drug trade, are paying the ultimate price in this war. The violence has torn apart families, leaving communities in mourning and fear. In Sinaloa, entire towns are trapped between the cartels and the government forces fighting them. The Sinaloa cartel, especially the BLO, controls key territories, or plazas, like Tijuana and parts of Culiacán. They use violence to enforce their rule, extorting businesses, kidnapping locals, and targeting anyone who defies them. Armed cartel enforces patrol streets, and the drug labs are guarded like fortresses. For residents, saying no to the cartel can mean death, but cooperating can make them targets of rival gangs or police. On the other side, Mexican authorities, under pressure from the U.S., have cracked down hard. In 2025, Mexico deployed 10,000 National Guard troops to Sinaloa and the U.S. border, aiming to disrupt cartel operations. These forces raid drug labs, like the one where 1,500 kilograms of fentanyl were seized in December 2024, and arrest cartel members. But these operations often spark violent clashes, with civilians caught in the middle. In one incident, a raid in Culiacán led to a shootout that killed a family of 4 hiding in their home. Residents describe living in a constant state of fear, unsure whether the next bullet will come from a cartel gunman or a soldier. The U.S. military's escalation has made things worse. Over 330 surveillance flights by U.S. Northern Command in 2025 have mapped cartel activities, raising fears of drone strikes or special forces raids. For communities, this means more uncertainty. A drone strike could destroy a drug lab but also kill nearby families. The U.S. naval deployment off Venezuela, aimed at disrupting cartel drug routes, has fueled rumors of American troops entering Mexico, adding to the tension. Locals feel like pawns in a larger war, with no safe place to turn. The violence has shattered daily life in Sinaloa. Schools closed during shootouts, leaving children stuck at home. Businesses shut down, unable to pay the cartels' extortion fees. Farmers, like those in Mexico's avocado industry, face threats from cartels demanding a cut of their profits. The economic toll is devastating, with jobs disappearing and families struggling to survive. Many residents have fled, joining the 1,500 missing or seeking safety in other parts of Mexico or the U.S. Those who stay live under a cloud of fear, avoiding public places and keeping the doors locked. The psychological toll is just as heavy. Parents grieve for missing children, like Vivian Espiro, while others live with the constant threat of violence. Community leaders who speak out against the cartels are targeted, leaving towns without voices to fight back. The sight of missing persons posters, updated weekly with new faces, has become a grim routine. For many, hope is fading, replaced by a sense of helplessness as the war between cartels and government forces rages on. The human cost of the U.S. cartel conflict in 2025 is a tragedy unfolding in real time. The 1,300 deaths and 1,500 missing in Sinaloa are more than numbers. They are mothers, fathers, and children like Vivian Espiro, whose lives were cut short by a war they didn't choose. The Sinaloa cartel's violence, fueled by their fight for power and profits from drugs like fentanyl and cocaine, has turned communities into battlegrounds. Mexican and U.S. efforts to stop the cartel, from drug seizures to military plans, have saved lives by disrupting the drug trade but have also escalated the violence, leaving civilians trapped. As the U.S. pushes forward with its military strategy, the risks grow. Drone strikes or raids could lead to more civilian deaths, while cartel retaliation could bring the violence to U.S. soil. Human rights groups warn that this war could destabilize Mexico further, creating a humanitarian crisis. For the people of Sinaloa, the future is uncertain. They long for peace but are caught in a conflict where neither side, cartels nor government forces, offers safety. The story of Sinaloa in 2025 is a heartbreaking reminder that in the war on drugs, it's often the innocent who suffer most. As the United States ramps up its war on the Sinaloa cartel in 2025, the battle has spilled over into boardrooms and diplomatic halls, creating deep economic cracks and tense talks between neighbors. The Trump administration's aggressive strategy, labeling cartels as terrorists, deploying warships, and threatening military strikes, has hit Mexico hard. New 25% tariffs on Mexican imports, a vital $935 billion trade relationship, and fears that Mexico could face the same fate as Venezuela have put both countries on edge. At the center of this storm is U.S. Ambassador Ronald Johnson, a former CIA officer pushing for tough cooperation. Across Latin America, leaders worry about a wave of U.S. interventionism that could upend the region. This is the story of how the anti-cartel push is reshaping U.S.-Mexico ties and sending ripples of concern far beyond the border. In February 2025, just weeks after President Donald Trump's inauguration, the White House dropped a bombshell, a 25% tariff on all imports from Mexico, effective immediately under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, IEEPA. Trump called it a powerful tool to force Mexico to crack down on cartels, illegal immigration, and fentanyl trafficking. The tariffs targeted everything from cars and avocados to electronics and steel, hitting the heart of North America's integrated economy. By October 2025, these duties had generated over $30 billion in U.S. revenue monthly, but at a steep cost to both sides. Mexico's economy, already fragile, felt the blow right away. Factories in border cities like Tijuana and Juarez slowed production as U.S. buyers hesitated over higher prices. Auto parts, which cross the border multiple times during assembly, saw costs skyrocket, delaying shipments and idling workers. Mexican exports to the U.S., worth $466.62 billion in the first 11 months of 2024 alone, faced an extra $116 billion in potential tariffs, according to estimates. Small businesses, like avocado farmers in mycocorn extorted by cartels, saw their U.S. markets shrink, pushing some to the brink of collapse. Inflation in Mexico jumped 4% by mid-year, and unemployment rose in export-heavy sectors. The U.S. wasn't spared either. American consumers paid more for everyday goods. Think higher prices for cars, beer, and fresh produce. Manufacturers like Ford and General Motors warned of supply chain chaos, with parts delays costing billions. The Congressional Budget Office estimated the tariffs would add nearly $1,300 to the average U.S. household's yearly expenses. Trump threatened to hike tariffs to 30% if Mexico didn't deploy 10,000 troops to the border and curb drug flows, but a brief 90-day pause in August 2025 offered little relief. This economic pressure was meant to squeeze the cartels by hurting their home turf, but it risked fracturing the deep trade ties built under the USMCA agreement. At the core of this tension is the U.S.-Mexico trade relationship, a powerhouse worth an estimated $935.1 billion in goods and services in 2024, on track to top $1 trillion in 2025 before tariffs bit in. Mexico is America's top trading partner, edging out Canada and China, with daily truck crossings at ports like Laredo, Texas, carrying $27.8 billion in goods each month. This flow powers jobs on both sides. 5 million in Mexico's export industries and millions more in U.S. manufacturing and retail. The tariffs threaten to unravel this web. Integrated supply chains mean a tariff on Mexican auto parts raises costs for U.S. assembled vehicles, hurting everyone. Mexican leaders argued it violated USMCA rules, which promised tariff-free trade for qualifying goods. By summer 2025, trade volumes dipped 5% at key crossings, with protests and blockades adding delays. Cargo theft in Mexico spiked 9%, as desperate drivers took risks amid economic strain. The International Monetary Fund warned that prolonged tariffs could shave 0.5% off global growth, with North America hit hardest. For Mexico, losing access to this $1 trillion lifeline could trigger a recession, worsening poverty and pushing more migrants north, ironically fueling the very border crisis Trump aimed to stop. As U.S. warships patrolled off Venezuela in late 2025, Mexico watched in horror, fearing it could be next. The naval deployment, 3 Aegis destroyers and 4,000 Marines targeting cartel routes, blurred lines between anti-drug ops and regime pressure. Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro's response, mobilizing 4.5 million militias and banning drones, looked like a preview of what could come. Mexican officials whispered that unproven U.S. claims linking Maduro to the Sinaloa cartel were a pretext for intervention, and similar accusations could justify strikes in Sinaloa. President Claudia Sheinbaum voiced these fears sharply. The United States is not going to come to Mexico with the military, she declared in a fiery speech. We cooperate, but there's not going to be an invasion, that is ruled out. Her administration pointed out Mexico had no evidence tying its cartels to Venezuelan ones, rejecting U.S. intelligence as biased. The sight of American forces in the Caribbean reopened old wounds from U.S. interventions in Latin America, from the Monroe Doctrine to Panama. Sheinbaum's 75% approval rating rested on her promises of sovereignty, and any hint of bending to Trump's threats could spark nationalist backlash or even unrest. To avoid Venezuela's path, Mexico ramped up cooperation, extraditing 55 cartel figures in 2025, deploying National Guard troops, and seizing record fentanyl hauls. But this, strategic compliance, felt like walking a tightrope. U.S. surveillance flights over Mexico, over 330 by fall, fueled paranoia that drone strikes were imminent. If tariffs escalated or strikes hit Mexican soil, Mexico risked economic collapse and social chaos, with cartels filling the power vacuum. Enter Ronald Johnson, Trump's pick for U.S. ambassador to Mexico, confirmed by the Senate on April 9, 2025. A 40-year veteran of the Army, CIA, and diplomacy, Johnson brought a no-nonsense security focus to the role. As ambassador to El Salvador from 2019-2021, he built close ties with President Nayib Bukele, even shielding him from U.S. corruption probes, a move that raised eyebrows but earned Trump's trust. Fluent in Spanish and a retired Army colonel, Johnson was seen as the perfect envoy for a tough love approach. In Mexico City, Johnson became the face of U.S. pressure. He pushed for joint ops against cartels, sharing intel from those 330 surveillance flights, and urged Mexico to hit fentanyl labs harder. During his confirmation hearing, he didn't rule out unilateral U.S. action if American lives were at stake, saying, "If a citizen's in danger, we act." His presence, a constant reminder of Pentagon plans, strained talks. Sheinbaum met him warily, demanding respect for sovereignty, while Johnson echoed Trump, "Get it under control, or we will." By October 2025, he reported progress, a 50% drop in fentanyl seizures at the border, but critics called him a regime enforcer, accusing him of prioritizing military goals over diplomacy. The U.S. strategy alarmed all of Latin America. Colombian President Gustavo Petro warned of Syria-like chaos if military ops normalized, fearing U.S. forces chasing cartels could destabilize the Andes. Over 30 human rights groups lobbied Congress to block strikes, citing risks to civilians in Sinaloa's 1,300 deaths and 1,500 disappearances. Leaders in Central America and the Caribbean saw Venezuela's militia buildup as a sign U.S. anti-cartel moves could justify interventions anywhere drugs flow. This interventionism echoed Cold War fears, with tariffs as the economic stick and warships as the military carrot. The IMF predicted slower regional growth, and investors fled Mexican markets amid uncertainty. Joint U.S.-Mexico training exercises continued, but under a shadow of distrust. As Sheinbaum balanced defiance with deals, like the August extraditions, the region held its breath, wondering if economic pain would force Mexico's hand or spark wider resistance. The economic and diplomatic fallout from the U.S. anti-cartel push in 2025 has turned allies into adversaries. The 25% tariffs threaten a $1 trillion trade engine, while Venezuela's fate looms as a warning. Ambassador Ronald Johnson embodies the hardline stance, but his efforts highlight the tightrope, cooperation without conquest. As tariffs bite and tensions simmer, the real question is whether this pressure dismantles the Sinaloa cartel or fractures North America. For now, Mexico digs in, but the cost, in jobs, trust, and stability, is mounting fast. In the shadow of America's escalating war on drugs, the Sinaloa cartel is not crumbling, it is changing shape. As 2025 unfolds, with U.S. drone surveillance flights buzzing over Mexican skies and warships patrolling Caribbean waters, the cartel has shown remarkable resilience. Far from surrendering to indictments, tariffs, and the terrorist label slapped on them by Executive Order 14,157, groups like the Sinaloa cartel and its rivals are adapting in clever, dangerous ways. They are scaling back visible fentanyl production to dodge raids, snapping up high-tech drone detection tools to counter U.S. spies in the air, and forging unlikely alliances with old enemies like the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, CJNG, and US-based gangs like MS-13. These moves are not just survival tactics. They're a blueprint for a more elusive, networked underworld. But as the cartels grow bolder, the risk of retaliation against American targets looms larger than ever, turning the border into a powder keg. This is the story of how the cartels are fighting back, and the deadly consequences that could follow. At the heart of the Sinaloa cartel's empire is fentanyl, the synthetic opioid that has killed over 80,000 Americans in a single year and fueled the U.S. opioid crisis. In early 2025, as Mexican raids, emboldened by U.S. intelligence from those 330 surveillance flights, shut down massive labs in Sinaloa, the cartel made a calculated pivot. Reports from U.S. and Mexican authorities show a sharp drop in fentanyl seizures at the border, down by more than 50% from late 2024 levels. At first, this looked like victory for the U.S. strategy. But insiders and intelligence leaks paint a different picture. The cartel is simply scaling back production in high-risk areas, not stopping it. In Sinaloa, the cartel's home turf, fentanyl labs that once churned out tons of the drug have gone quiet. The December 2024 seizure of 1,500 kilograms, the largest ever, hit the Beltran Leyva organization, BLO, a Sinaloa faction led by Pedro Inzunza Noriega, hard. In response, operatives relocated operations to safer spots, deeper into rural Michoacán or even across borders to Guatemala and Honduras, where oversight is thinner. Smaller, mobile, kitchen labs replaced industrial-scale facilities, using basic chemistry kits smuggled from China to produce batches on the fly. This shift makes it tougher for drones or special forces to pinpoint targets, as labs now pop up and vanish like ghosts. The DEA's 2025 National Drug Threat Assessment confirms this adaptation. While overall fentanyl flows have dipped, purity levels remain high, suggesting the cartel is prioritizing quality over quantity to maintain profits. By scaling back in Sinaloa, the cartel avoids drawing more heat from Mexico's 10,000 National Guard troops or US-backed raids. It's a smart play. Reduce the footprint where the eyes are watching most, and let the drug seep in through quieter channels like human mules or hidden vehicle compartments, as seen in the October 2025 Laredo cocaine bust. But this retreat comes at a cost. Internal tensions are rising, with factions like the Chapitos, sons of El Chapo, blaming each other for lost revenue, fueling the very infighting that has already claimed 1,300 lives in Sinaloa. The U.S. military's aerial eyes, U-2 spy planes, P-8 Poseidons, and drones mapping cartel routes, have forced the Sinaloa cartel to arm itself with cutting-edge countermeasures. By mid-2025, intelligence reports revealed cartel members investing heavily in drone detection technology, turning narcos into amateur tech warriors. A stark example, a Sinaloa operative from the Maito Flaco faction was photographed carrying a Skyfend counter-UAS jammer, a $100,000 device that scrambles drone signals and forces them to land or retreat. These jammers, smuggled from China or bought on the black market, are now standard kit for cartel security teams guarding labs and plazas. This isn't paranoia, it's necessity. The CJNG, Sinaloa's fierce rival, has long led the charge in aerial warfare, deploying weaponized quadcopters since 2020 to drop grenades on enemies. In 2025, the drone operators unit escalated, using first-person view (FPV) drones for precise attacks, as seen in a viral April video showing a strike in Michoacán. Sinaloa, hit hard by U.S. surveillance, followed suit. Seizures by Mexican forces uncovered not just offensive drones but defensive arrays, radar detectors, signal jammers, and even anti-drone nets draped over fentanyl storage sites. The Armed Conflict Location and Event Data Project, ACLED, tracked at least 11 drone-related deaths in Mexico's first 5 months of 2025, mostly from cartel-on-cartel hits, showing how this tech arms race is spilling blood. For the Sinaloa cartel, these tools level the playing field against Uncle Sam's high-tech gaze. A jammer can blind a U.S. drone mid-flight, buying time to move a shipment or scatter a lab crew. But acquiring this gear isn't cheap or easy. It requires alliances with international suppliers, like Chinese firms peddling dual-use tech, and bribes to port officials. This investment signals a deeper evolution. Cartels are no longer just smugglers. They're building a low-intensity air force, inspired by conflicts in Ukraine or the Middle East. The risk, as cartels master these systems, they could turn them outward, using jammers to disrupt U.S. border patrols or even commercial flights near the frontier. Nothing shows the cartel's adaptability like its shifting partnerships. The Sinaloa cartel's infamous internal rift, between the violent Chapitos faction and the more discreet Maeza group, has cracked open doors for deals that would have seemed impossible a year ago. By June 2025, reports from the New York Times and the assessments pointed to a fragile alliance between Los Chapitos and the CJNG, Sinaloa's longtime nemesis. In a desperate bid for survival, the Chapitos offered up territory in Baja California and Tijuana, key smuggling plazas, in exchange for CJNG firepower and protection against Mexican troops. This pact, if it holds, could create the world's largest drug network. The CJNG, already dominant in fentanyl precursor imports through ports like Manzanillo, brings aggressive tactics and tech savvy, like the drone units. Sinaloa contributes its vast U.S. distribution web and alliances with street gangs. Together, they could flood the border with drugs while sharing intel to evade U.S. strikes. ACLED data shows clashes between these groups and rivals spiked 16% in Tijuana from July 2024 to March 2025, but joint ops against smaller foes suggest coordination. Further afield, the Sinaloa cartel is tightening ties with MS-13, the Salvadoran gang now designated a foreign terrorist organization alongside the cartels. MS-13 handles U.S. street-level distribution, from Los Angeles to New York, laundering money through Chinese underground banks and extorting migrants. In 2025, joint ventures expanded, MS-13 smuggling Sinaloa fentanyl via human mules, while Sinaloa supplies MS-13 with weapons smuggled from Guatemala. The State Department's May 2025 designations highlighted MS-13's use of IEDs and drones against Salvadoran officials, hinting at shared tactics bleeding north. These alliances make the cartel more resilient. Lose a plaza in Mexico, gain a pipeline in the US, but they also globalize the threat, linking narcos to groups like Hezbollah for explosives training or FARC for counter-military know-how. As cartels adapt, the specter of retaliation grows darker. History shows they don't take hits lying down. When Mexico arrested Ovidio Guzman in 2019, Sinaloa unleashed citywide chaos in Culiacán, burning buses and battling troops. In 2025, with U.S. drone strikes already killing CJNG leaders and civilians in simulated scenarios, experts warn of blowback. A win without war exercise in February painted a grim picture. Cartel reprisals targeting U.S. Special Forces families, border agents, or even infrastructure. The risks are multifaceted. Domestically, MS-13 could ramp up hits on de-informants or launch IED attacks in U.S. cities, using drones for surveillance or drops. A 2025 hack of the U.S. Court's ECF system, possibly. Cartel-linked, exposed witness info, hinting at cyber retaliation. Abroad, alliances mean Sinaloa could greenlight CJNG drone strikes on U.S. assets in Mexico, like consulates or aid convoys. Politico warned in August that unilateral U.S. action could spawn new recruits, turning deported narcos into overseas threats. Worse, this could escalate to terrorism. Public violence to intimidate, as MS-13 does in El Salvador, or bombings echoing Hezbollah tactics. With cartels controlling oil theft and extortion rackets worth billions, they have cash to buy advanced arms. The Atlantic Council urges prep for such hits, protecting operators and families, but the human cost could mirror Sinaloa's 1,500 disappearances, now exported north. As one D report put it, infighting weakens cartels short-term but invites bolder retaliation long-term. In 2025, the Sinaloa cartel and its partners are proving why they're called transnational threats, by scaling back fentanyl in hotspots, jamming U.S. drones, and allying with CJNG and MS-13, they've turned pressure into evolution. These adaptations make them harder to hit, more profitable, and deadlier. But the retaliation risks, strikes on U.S. soil, cyber chaos, or terror abroad, could turn the drug war into something far bloodier. As Ambassador Ronald Johnson pushes for more cooperation, the question hangs: will these changes dismantle the cartels, or unleash a monster that bites back harder than ever? The United States' aggressive war against the Sinaloa cartel in 2025 has sent shockwaves far beyond the US-Mexico border, reshaping global drug networks and stirring fears of chaos across Latin America. With drone surveillance, naval deployments, and historic indictments labeling cartel leaders as terrorists, the US is hitting the cartels harder than ever. But this fight is not confined to North America. It disrupts drug flows tied to Chinese chemical suppliers and West African trafficking routes, raising the stakes for global crime networks. In Latin America, leaders worry that US military actions could spark a Syria-like crisis, destabilizing entire countries. Human rights groups are sounding alarms about civilian casualties, pointing to the 1,300 deaths and 1,500 missing in Sinaloa as a warning. This is the story of how the US anti-cartel campaign is reshaping the world, and the risks it carries for millions. The Sinaloa cartel's drug empire relies on a global supply chain, and the US strategy in 2025 is hitting it hard. Fentanyl, the cartel's deadliest product, starts with precursor chemicals from China. These chemicals, often legal compounds like 4-AP or NPP, are shipped to Mexican ports like Manzanillo, where cartels like the Sinaloa and Jalisco New Generation Cartel, CJNG, turn them into fentanyl in hidden labs. The US has pressured China to crack down, and in early 2025, Beijing tightened export controls after diplomatic talks, cutting the flow of precursors by 20%, according to the D. This forced the Sinaloa cartel to scale back fentanyl production in Sinaloa, as seen after the 1,500 kilogram seizure in December 2024, and rely on pricier black market suppliers. But the cartels are adapting, turning to new routes. West Africa, a growing hub for drug trafficking, has become a critical detour. Ports in Guinea-Bissau and Nigeria, long used to move South American cocaine to Europe, are now funneling precursors to Mexico via cargo ships and small planes. The UN Office on Drugs and Crime reported a 15% spike in cocaine seizures in West African ports in 2025, linked to Sinaloa and CJNG operatives. US naval deployments off Venezuela, including 3 Aegis destroyers, aim to choke these maritime routes, but cartels have shifted to narco subs, homemade submarines that slip past patrols. A March 2025 seizure off Colombia nabbed one such sub carrying 800 kilograms of cocaine, showing the cartel's ingenuity. These disruptions have global consequences. Reduced fentanyl flows to the US have driven up street prices, pushing addicts to riskier alternatives like heroin, spiking overdoses in cities like Chicago by 10%. In Europe, cocaine shortages have strengthened local gangs, sparking turf wars in London and Amsterdam. China's tightened controls have also hit legitimate chemical exporters, costing jobs and straining US-China trade talks. Meanwhile, West African nations, already fragile, face growing corruption as cartels bribe officials to keep routes open. The US strategy is squeezing the drug trade, but it's also reshaping global crime, pushing cartels to new markets and methods. In Latin America, the US war on cartels is raising alarms about regional stability. Colombian President Gustavo Petro, a vocal critic, warned in July 2025 that US military actions could lead to Syria-like chaos across the region. The deployment of US warships, USS Gravely, USS Jason Dunham, and USS Samson, off Venezuela, backed by 4,000 Marines, has fueled these fears. Venezuela's response, mobilizing 4.5 million militia members and banning drones, shows how US anti-cartel moves are seen as a threat to entire nations, not just criminals. If the US launches drone strikes or special forces raids in Mexico, as authorized by a secret Pentagon directive, other countries worry they could be next. Mexico is already feeling the heat. Over 330 U.S. surveillance flights in 2025 have mapped Sinaloa's drug labs, raising fears of strikes on Mexican soil. President Claudia Sheinbaum has rejected U.S. military intervention, calling it an invasion, but the pressure is intense. Mexico's extradition of 55 cartel figures in 2025 and deployment of 10,000 National Guard troops show cooperation, but a misstep could spark conflict. If U.S. drones hit Sinaloa, killing civilians alongside cartel targets, it could ignite protests or even armed resistance, echoing Syria's descent into factional violence. Other Latin American nations are on edge. Guatemala and Honduras, where cartels are relocating fentanyl labs, fear becoming collateral damage. Brazil, a key cocaine transit hub, has beefed up border patrols, worried that U.S. actions could push trafficking south. The Organization of American States held an emergency meeting in September 2025, where Petro and others called for dialogue over militarization. They argue that U.S. intervention could destabilize weak governments, letting cartels or militias fill the void, much like Syria's warlords. The memory of U.S. interventions, like Panama in 1989, looms large, making leaders wary of a new era of American dominance. Human rights groups are sounding urgent warnings about the human cost of the U.S. campaign. Over 30 organizations, including Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, urged Congress in August 2025 to block military actions, citing risks to civilians. In Sinaloa, the heart of the conflict, cartel violence has already killed over 1,300 people and left 1,500 missing in 2025. Stories like that of Vivian Espiro, a young woman found dead after disappearing in a cartel clash, highlight the toll on innocents. These groups fear that U.S. drone strikes or raids, like those planned against the Beltran Leyva organization, could worsen the bloodshed. The numbers are stark. In Sinaloa, cartel infighting, fueled by U.S. pressure, has turned towns into battlegrounds. Shootouts and kidnappings are daily threats, with civilians caught between cartel gunmen and Mexican troops. A July 2025 raid in Culiacán killed a family of 3 when soldiers mistook their home for a drug safehouse. Human rights advocates warn that U.S. strikes could repeat such tragedies on a larger scale, as drones struggle to distinguish targets in crowded neighborhoods. The Pentagon's shock and awe strategy, inspired by anti-ISIS campaigns, risks collateral damage that could alienate communities and boost cartel recruitment. Beyond Mexico, the naval deployment off Venezuela raises red flags. A miscalculated strike could kill Venezuelan civilians, inflaming anti-U.S. sentiment and strengthening Maduro's regime. Groups like the International Crisis Group argue that militarizing the drug war could drive refugees north, overwhelming borders already strained by 5% drops in trade from U.S. tariffs. The UN High Commissioner for Human Rights called for restraint in October 2025, citing international law violations if strikes occur without Mexico's consent. These concerns echo Sinaloa's crisis, where missing persons posters and grieving families are a grim reminder of the stakes. The U.S. war on cartels in 2025 is reshaping the global landscape. By disrupting Chinese precursor supplies and West African drug routes, it's forcing cartels to adapt, spreading their influence to new corners of the world. In Latin America, fears of a Syria-like collapse are growing, as U.S. military moves threaten to destabilize fragile nations. Human rights groups highlight the civilian toll: 1,300 dead, 1,500 missing in Sinaloa alone, as a warning of what's to come if drones or troops strike. The campaign has slowed drug flows, but at a cost: global trade disruptions, regional tensions, and a rising risk of violence spilling over. As the U.S. presses forward, the world watches, wondering if this war will crush the cartels or ignite a crisis that engulfs us all. The United States' war on the Sinaloa cartel in 2025, with its historic narco-terrorism charges and military escalation, is not a new fight. For decades, the U.S. has battled powerful Mexican drug cartels, from the Arellano Felix cartel in the 1990s to other notorious groups like the Gulf Cartel. Each campaign brought arrests, seizures, and hard-won victories, but the 2025 crackdown on the Sinaloa cartel, led by figures like Pedro Inzunza Noriega, marks a bold shift. By labeling the cartel a foreign terrorist organization, FTO, under Executive Order 14157 and deploying warships, drones, and special forces, the U.S. has moved from law enforcement to warfare. This story explores the history of U.S. anti-cartel efforts, compares the current campaign to past battles like the one against the Arellano Felix cartel, and explains why the terrorist designation and military approach are so different. The U.S. war on Mexican cartels began in earnest in the 1980s, when cocaine flooded American cities. The murder of D. Agent Enrique Kiki Camarena in 1985 by the Guadalajara cartel, a predecessor to the Sinaloa cartel, was a turning point. It led to Operation Leyenda, a massive U.S. effort to arrest those responsible, including Rafael Caro Quintero, who was extradited in 2025. This set the stage for decades of U.S.-Mexico cooperation, focusing on arrests, extraditions, and drug seizures through agencies like the DEA, FBI, and Homeland Security Investigations, HSI. One of the most significant campaigns was against the Arellano Felix Organization, AFO, also known as the Tijuana Cartel, in the 1990s and early 2000s. Based in Tijuana, just across from San Diego, the AFO controlled key drug routes into California. Known for brutal violence, including beheadings and mass shootings, the cartel dominated the border's drug trade. The Southern District of California, the same court leading the 2025 Sinaloa case, became a hub for dismantling the AFO. Through years of investigations, wiretaps, and undercover work, U.S. authorities arrested key leaders like Benjamin Arellano Felix in 2002 and Eduardo Arellano Felix in 2008. By 2012, the AFO was a shadow of its former self, weakened by arrests and rival attacks from the Sinaloa cartel. Other campaigns targeted groups like the Gulf Cartel and Los Zetas. In the 2000s, the Gulf Cartel, based in Tamaulipas, smuggled tons of cocaine and heroin into Texas. U.S. and Mexican operations, including joint task forces, led to the 2003 capture of leader Osiel Cárdenas Guillén. Los Zetas, a violent offshoot, faced similar pressure, with leaders like Heriberto Lazcano killed in 2012. These efforts relied heavily on law enforcement tactics, intelligence gathering, sting operations, and extraditions, often backed by Mexico's military. The U.S. offered rewards, up to $5 million for top leaders, and shared intel to track shipments, like the 335.10 pounds of cocaine seized in Laredo in October 2025. The 2025 campaign against the Sinaloa cartel builds on this history but takes a radically different path. On May 13, 2025, the Southern District of California unsealed an indictment charging Sinaloa leaders Pedro Inzunza Noriega and his son, Pedro Inzunza Coronel, with narco-terrorism and material support for terrorism, charges never used against cartels before. This was driven by the Beltran-Leyva Organization, BLO, a Sinaloa faction blamed for trafficking tens of thousands of kilograms of fentanyl, linked to over 80,000 U.S. overdose deaths annually. The December 2024 seizure of 1,500 kilograms of fentanyl in Sinaloa showed the scale of their operation. Unlike past efforts, the 2025 crackdown is fueled by Executive Order 14157, signed by President Donald Trump on February 20, 2025. This order labeled the Sinaloa cartel and 5 others, including the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, CJNG, as FTOs. This terrorist designation, combined with a secret Pentagon directive authorizing drone strikes, special forces raids, and naval operations, marks a leap from traditional methods. Over 330 U.S. surveillance flights scoured Mexico in 2025, mapping drug labs and routes, while warships like USS Gravely patrolled off Venezuela to disrupt cartel sea lanes. These moves echo military campaigns against groups like ISIS, not the police work used against the AFO or Gulf Cartel. Comparing strategies. Law enforcement versus warfare. The fight against the Arellano Felix cartel was a classic law enforcement operation. The D and FBI worked with Mexican police to build cases, using informants and wiretaps to track leaders. Arrests were surgical, often in Mexico, followed by extraditions to U.S. courts. For example, Benjamin Arellano Felix faced charges in San Diego for drug trafficking and money laundering, not terrorism. The focus was on dismantling the AFO's leadership through legal means, avoiding direct U.S. military action. Seizures, like tons of cocaine nabbed at the border, were key, but the U.S. relied on Mexico's forces for raids, keeping American boots off the ground. The Gulf Cartel campaign followed a similar playbook. Joint U.S.-Mexico task forces targeted leaders like Cardenas Guillen, using intelligence to intercept shipments and freeze bank accounts. The U.S. offered rewards and pushed for extraditions, with Mexico's military handling most arrests. Violence was high. Los Zetas massacres shocked the world, but the U.S. stayed in a supporting role, sharing intel rather than deploying troops. In contrast, the 2025 Sinaloa crackdown is a hybrid of law enforcement and warfare. The narco-terrorism charges against the Inzunzes carry life sentences and $20 million fines, far harsher than past drug trafficking penalties. The FTO label unlocks counterterrorism tools, asset freezes, travel bans, and military strikes. The Pentagon's directive, revealed in August 2025, allows drone attacks on fentanyl labs and raids to kill or capture leaders like Chapo Isidro. The naval deployment off Venezuela, with 4,000 Marines, signals a willingness to act far beyond Mexico's borders. Unlike the AFO takedown, which avoided U.S. military involvement, the Sinaloa campaign risks direct conflict, with over 330 surveillance flights already straining U.S.-Mexico ties. The terrorist designation changes everything. Past campaigns treated cartels as criminal enterprises, focusing on arrests and trials. The FTO label, backed by the Immigration and Nationality Act, frames the Sinaloa cartel as a national security threat, like Al-Qaeda or ISIS. This justifies military action, from drone strikes to naval interdictions, and expands U.S. powers to target cartel finances and allies, like MS-13 or Chinese chemical suppliers. Attorney General Pamela Bondi called the cartel a cancer that demands a powerful legal response, reflecting this shift. The military approach also sets 2025 apart. Earlier efforts leaned on Mexico's army and police, with the U.S. providing funds and intel through programs like the Merida Initiative. Now, the U.S. is taking the lead, with surveillance flights and warships acting independently. This risks violating Mexico's sovereignty, as President Claudia Sheinbaum warned, calling U.S. intervention an invasion. The AFO campaign succeeded by working with Mexico. The Sinaloa crackdown, with its unilateral moves, threatens diplomatic fallout. The 2025 Sinaloa crackdown builds on the U.S.'s long fight against cartels but breaks new ground. Compared to the Arellano Felix or Gulf Cartel campaigns, the terrorist label and military tactics are a gamble. They aim to crush the cartel's fentanyl empire but risk escalating violence. Sinaloa's 1,300 deaths and 1,500 missing show the stakes. Past victories weakened cartels without U.S. troops. Today's strategy could spark a broader conflict, alienating allies like Mexico or destabilizing the region. As history repeats and diverges, the world watches to see if this bold approach will end the cartel threat or ignite a new war. The crossroads of conflict. Future scenarios in the U.S. War on the Sinaloa cartel. As 2025 draws to a close, the United States war against the Sinaloa cartel stands at a critical juncture. With narco-terrorism charges against leaders like Pedro Inzunza Noriega, over 330 surveillance flights mapping Mexican drug labs, and U.S. warships patrolling Caribbean waters, the fight has escalated far beyond traditional law enforcement. The terrorist designation under Executive Order 14157 and the Pentagon's secret directive for drone strikes and special forces raids signal a new era of warfare. But what happens next? Will the U.S. launch military strikes, face cartel retaliation, or find a diplomatic path with Mexico? The stakes are enormous, not just for U.S.-Mexico relations, but for regional stability and the global drug trade. This is the story of the possible futures awaiting this high-stakes conflict and what they mean for millions across the Americas and beyond. Scenario 1. U.S. military strikes. One possible future sees the U.S. acting on its Pentagon directive, launching drone strikes or special forces raids against Sinaloa cartel targets in Mexico. By early 2026, U.S. drones could target fentanyl labs in Sinaloa, like those raided in December 2024, or safe houses holding leaders like Chapo Isidro. Elite units, such as Navy SEALs, might cross the border in covert operations to capture or kill figures like Pedro Inzanza Noriega, mirroring tactics used against ISIS. The naval deployment off Venezuela, 3 Aegis destroyers and 4,000 Marines, could expand to Mexican waters, intercepting cartel drug shipments or striking coastal hideouts. These strikes could cripple the cartel's operations, disrupting fentanyl production and smuggling routes. A successful hit on a major lab or leader might slash drug flows, building on the 50% drop in border fentanyl seizures reported in 2025. However, the risks are high. Civilian casualties, like the 1,300 deaths and 1,500 missing in Sinaloa, could skyrocket if drones misfire in crowded towns. Mexico, already furious over U.S. surveillance flights, might view strikes as an act of war, prompting President Claudia Sheinbaum to cut diplomatic ties or expel U.S. agents. Protests could erupt, fueled by Mexico's history of resisting U.S. intervention. Cartels might also escalate violence, targeting Mexican troops or civilians to sow chaos, further destabilizing the region. For U.S.-Mexico relations, unilateral strikes would be a disaster, potentially halting the $1 trillion trade partnership and sparking border tensions. Regionally, countries like Colombia and Guatemala could fear becoming next, echoing warnings of Syria-like chaos. The global drug trade might shift, with cartels moving operations to Central America or Asia, complicating enforcement. Scenario 2. Cartel retaliation. Another future envisions the Sinaloa cartel striking back against U.S. pressure. The cartel's adaptations in 2025, scaling back fentanyl production, using drone detection tech, and allying with the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, CJNG, and MS-13, show they're ready to fight. If the U.S. launches strikes or tightens tariffs beyond the current 25%, the cartel could retaliate. Intelligence warns of attacks on U.S. soil. MS-13, with its U.S. networks, might target D agents or border posts with IEDs or drone drops, as seen in El Salvador. A 2025 hack of U.S. court systems suggests cartels could launch cyberattacks, exposing sensitive data or disrupting border operations. In Mexico, the cartel could unleash chaos, as they did in 2019 when Culiacán became a war zone after Ovidio Guzman's arrest. Sinaloa's 1,300 deaths in 2025 show their capacity for violence. They could burn cities, attack U.S. consulates, or kidnap American tourists to force concessions. Alliances with CJNG could amplify this, with coordinated strikes using CJNG's weaponized drones. Globally, partnerships with Chinese suppliers or West African traffickers could fund advanced arms, like anti-aircraft systems, to counter U.S. drones. Retaliation would escalate the conflict into a low-intensity war, with U.S. cities facing gang violence and Mexico descending into further bloodshed. The cartel's global reach could disrupt drug markets, spiking prices and overdoses in Europe and Asia. Politically, U.S. public support for the war could wane if American lives are lost, forcing a policy rethink. US-Mexico relations would strain further, with Mexico caught between fighting cartels and managing public anger over US actions. Regional stability would falter as cartels exploit chaos, recruiting desperate youth. The global drug trade could grow deadlier, with cartels diversifying into meth or cocaine to offset fentanyl losses. Scenario 3. Diplomatic resolution. A third path imagines a diplomatic breakthrough. By mid-2026, Mexico and the US could negotiate a deal to avoid military escalation. Mexico's 2025 efforts, extraditing 55 cartel figures, deploying 10,000 National Guard troops, and seizing 1,500 kilograms of fentanyl, show willingness to cooperate. Sheinbaum could offer more extraditions, like those of Maito Flaco or El Chino, in exchange for the US pausing tariffs and drone flights. Joint task forces, building on past successes like the Arellano Felix takedown, could target cartel finances and labs without US boots on the ground. Ambassador Ronald Johnson, despite his hardline stance, could broker this, leveraging his ties with Latin American leaders. Diplomacy could stabilize the border, preserving trade and reducing violence. Joint operations might dismantle key cartel cells, like the BLO, while avoiding civilian casualties. Mexico's sovereignty would be respected, calming nationalist tensions. However, cartels could exploit any slowdown, rebuilding fentanyl labs in remote areas or leaning on CJNG alliances to keep drugs flowing. US-Mexico relations could strengthen, safeguarding the $1 trillion trade network and boosting USMCA cooperation. Regional stability would improve, with Latin American nations reassured that intervention isn't imminent. The global drug trade might face sustained pressure, but cartels' adaptability means the fight would continue, requiring long-term commitment. What's at stake? US-Mexico relations. The $1 trillion trade partnership hangs in the balance. Strikes or retaliation could halt cross-border commerce, spiking prices and unemployment. Diplomacy could preserve this lifeline, but only if both sides compromise. Mexico's fear of becoming the next Venezuela drives Sheinbaum's resistance, while US demands for results test trust. Regional stability. Latin America is on edge. Strikes could spark chaos, pushing cartels to destabilize Guatemala or Honduras. Retaliation might embolden groups like MS-13, spreading violence. A diplomatic path could calm fears, but only if it avoids the Syria-like collapse warned by Colombia's Gustavo Petro. Venezuela's militia buildup shows how quickly tensions can escalate. Global drug trade. The US campaign has disrupted fentanyl and cocaine flows, but cartels are shifting to West Africa and Asia. Strikes might slow production, but retaliation could flood new markets. Diplomacy could sustain pressure, but cartels' alliances with CJNG and global networks mean drugs will keep moving unless the root causes, poverty, corruption, and demand, are addressed. A future in the balance. The US cartel conflict in 2025 is a high-stakes gamble. Military strikes could hit the Sinaloa cartel hard but risk war and civilian deaths. Cartel retaliation could bring violence to US streets, escalating a crisis already claiming 1,300 lives in Sinaloa. Diplomacy offers hope but demands trust that's fraying fast. As drones fly, warships sail, and cartels adapt, the future of US-Mexico ties, Latin American stability, and the global drug trade hangs in the balance. The choices made in 2026 will decide whether this war ends in victory, chaos, or a fragile peace. The US war against the Sinaloa cartel in 2025 stands as a pivotal chapter in the decades-long struggle against drug trafficking, one that has redefined the battlefield and raised the stakes to unprecedented heights. From the historic narco-terrorism indictments of Pedro Inzunza Noriega and his son in San Diego to the deployment of US warships off Venezuela and over 330 surveillance flights mapping Mexican drug labs, the campaign has shifted from law enforcement to a hybrid of legal, economic, and military warfare. The Beltran-Leyva organization's fentanyl empire, responsible for tens of thousands of kilograms flooding U.S. streets, faces relentless pressure, evidenced by the record-breaking 1,500 kilogram fentanyl seizure in Sinaloa and the $4.4 million cocaine bust in Laredo. Yet, the cartel's adaptability, forging alliances with the CJNG and MS-13, acquiring drone detection technology, and relocating operations, reveals a resilient foe undeterred by Executive Order 14157's terrorist designation. The human cost in Sinaloa, 1,300 dead, 1,500 missing, and stories like Vivian Espiro's, underscores the tragedy of communities trapped between cartel violence and government crackdowns. Economically, the 25% tariffs on Mexican imports threaten a $1 trillion trade partnership, while diplomatically, Mexico's defiance under President Claudia Sheinbaum clashes with U.S. Ambassador Ronald Johnson's hardline push, risking a rift with echoes of Venezuela's crisis. Regionally, fears of a Syria-like collapse loom as Latin American nations brace for spillover, and globally, disruptions to Chinese precursor supplies and West African drug routes reshape the drug trade's map. Looking ahead, three paths emerge. U.S. military strikes could dismantle cartel strongholds but ignite a diplomatic firestorm and civilian casualties. Cartel retaliation, leveraging MS-13 or cyber capabilities, could bring violence to American soil, or a diplomatic resolution, building on Mexico's extraditions and troop deployments, could preserve stability but demands delicate trust. The stakes are monumental. U.S.-Mexico relations, regional peace, and the global fight against drugs hang in the balance. As an expert observer, I see this moment as a test of resolve and restraint. The U.S. must balance its aggressive tactics with Mexico's sovereignty and address root causes, poverty, corruption, and U.S. drug demand, to avoid a Pyrrhic victory. Without strategic calibration, this war risks not just dismantling the Sinaloa cartel but fracturing the Americas, leaving a legacy of chaos where victory was sought. The choices made now will shape the region's future for decades, demanding wisdom as much as strength.